The alarm cut through my sleep before my eyes even opened, and I was on my feet before I understood why. Red light pulsed across the walls of my quarters, aboard the research vessel Halcyon Reach. Something had changed at the dig site. Something that had never changed in 3 generations of careful, useless study. I pulled on my boots without tying them and ran. My name is Elena Voss, and 6 months ago, I was teaching graduate seminars on dead languages nobody would ever speak again. Now I was sprinting down a metal corridor 200 light-years from Earth, chasing a sound that shouldn't exist, on a planet with no atmosphere and no history that any species could explain. The portal was doing something. I reached the observation deck out of breath, my hair still damp from where I'd fallen asleep with it wet. Commander Marcus Bell was already there, along with 2 members of the Coalition science team, an old Draconi elder named Thessaly Rowe, and a VASP counselor, whose name I still struggled to pronounce correctly even after 4 months of working beside her. Nobody looked at me. Everybody was staring through the reinforced viewport at the structure on the surface below. The portal stood exactly as it always had, a ring of dark material, taller than any building I had seen back home, embedded into the crust of a planet that had been dead for longer than anyone could measure. It had no visible seams, no markings that any scanner had ever picked up. For 3 generations, since the Coalition first found it, the portal had done exactly one thing whenever a living creature approached it. It rejected them. Every species that had tried, and there had been dozens, was met with the same result. A wall of invisible force, not violent, not injurious, but absolute. No one had ever managed to walk closer than 11 meters from its base. Instruments failed within that radius. Cameras froze. Radios turned to static. It was as if the portal existed in its own private silence, refusing to acknowledge that anyone else was even standing there. Until 4 minutes ago. "Report," Marcus said without turning around. His voice was steady, but I had worked with him long enough now to hear the strain underneath it. One of the science officers, a nervous young man named Owen Farrell, was hunched over a console, his fingers moving fast. Energy signature spiked at 0311, he said. No external trigger, no probe was near it. No animal, no debris, nothing crossed the boundary. It just woke up on its own. "Show me," Marcus said. The main screen shifted to a replay of the last 10 minutes. I watched the portal's dark surface begin to shimmer, faint lines of light tracing patterns across it that hadn't been visible before. The lines pulsed once, twice, then settled into a slow rhythm, like a heartbeat. "That's new," I said quietly. Thessaly Rowe, the Draconi elder, turned her long neck toward me. Her species had been part of the Coalition since before humans had learned to build fire into engines, and in all that time, I had rarely heard her speak without being spoken to first. "In 400 years of records," she said, "the structure has never displayed activity without a trigger. This is not new. This is unprecedented." The VASP counselor, whose name I finally managed to recall, was Vex Oranis, made a sound low in her throat that I had learned to associate with distrust. Perhaps something has changed in the readings themselves. Faulty instruments would explain a false signal. "The instruments are fine," Owen said, a little too quickly, the way people speak when they're frightened and trying not to show it. "I checked them twice already." Marcus finally turned around. His eyes found mine, and for a second I thought he was going to send me back to my quarters, tell me this was a matter for the science staff and the security detail, that a linguist who specialized in dead alphabets had no place on the deck during an active event. Instead, he asked me a question I did not expect. "Voss, you've been studying the failed approach patterns for months. Have you ever seen anything like this in the old logs?" I had. That was the terrifying part. 3 weeks earlier, buried in an archive of failed contact attempts going back to the earliest Coalition expeditions, I had noticed something nobody else seemed to have flagged. The rejections were not uniform. When you looked at the raw data, instead of the summary reports, the force field that pushed visitors away didn't behave the same way every time. Sometimes it repelled instantly, violently, the moment a creature crossed the 11-meter boundary. Other times it seemed to hesitate, a fraction of a second of delay before the rejection came, as if something inside the structure was making a decision each time, rather than simply executing a fixed defense. I had written a memo about it. Nobody had read the memo. Memos from junior consultants rarely got read on a research vessel where the senior staff had spent decades chasing this mystery and coming home with nothing. There's a pattern in the delay times, I said now, stepping closer to the console. It's subtle. You'd only see it if you plotted every recorded rejection against the species that triggered it. The delay isn't random. It correlates with something. I never figured out what, because the differences are too small to separate from instrument noise using the equipment we had access to before this week. Vex Uranus folded her arms, 4 elbows clicking softly against each other, in a gesture of impatience I had come to recognize. You are suggesting the portal is intelligent. I'm suggesting it's selective, I said. There's a difference. Marcus studied the screen again, where the pulsing lines had begun to shift color, moving from a pale blue toward something warmer, something closer to gold. Selective toward what? Nobody answered him, because nobody knew. That was the question that had consumed 3 generations of the best minds the Coalition had. What was the portal waiting for? What would satisfy whatever ancient test had been built into its silent, patient architecture? Entire careers had been spent trying to answer that question, and entire careers had ended in failure, transfer requests, and quiet resignation. I felt something tighten in my chest as I watched the golden light spread further across the surface of the structure. It looked, for a strange half-second, like it was breathing. "Command wants a full report within the hour," Marcus said, turning to the room. "Farrell, pull every sensor log from the last 12 hours and cross-reference it against baseline. Counselor Uranus, I need your people running interference checks in case this is some kind of transmission we're not equipped to detect. Elder Rowe, if there's anything in the Draconi archive about structures like this reacting spontaneously, I need it now, not tomorrow." Everyone began to move except me. Marcus caught my eye again, and this time his expression had shifted into something I hadn't seen from him before. Not command, something closer to uncertainty. "Voss," he said, quieter now, so the others wouldn't hear over their own movement. "That delay pattern you found. Walk with me." I followed him out of the observation deck and down a narrower corridor that led toward the research wing, my mind racing to keep pace with what was happening. 6 months ago, I had been correcting undergraduate essays about the grammatical structure of a language extinct for 11,000 years. Now I was being pulled into a briefing about an artifact that might be waking up for the first time in recorded history, and somehow my forgotten memo about statistical noise and rejection delays had become relevant enough for a fleet commander to want a private word. "You think the correlation you found means something," Marcus said as we walked. It wasn't a question. "I think it means the rejections aren't a simple barrier," I said. "A barrier doesn't hesitate. A barrier doesn't need time to decide whether to activate. What I found in the data looks more like evaluation. Like something inside that structure is reading each visitor before deciding what to do with them. Reading them how? I don't know," I admitted. "I've spent 3 weeks trying to figure that out, and I keep hitting the same wall everyone else has hit for decades. We don't have the right instruments, we don't have the right frame of reference, and we don't have a single successful contact to compare against. It's like trying to understand the rules of a game you've only ever watched people lose." Marcus stopped walking. We had reached the observation window that looked directly down onto the surface where the portal stood, its golden light now steady, pulsing at a rhythm that felt almost deliberate, almost patient. "There's something you should know before the report goes out," he said. "Command flagged your memo 2 days ago. Not because of the delay pattern, because of something else you wrote in the conclusion. You said the pattern might correlate with a trait rather than a species. Do you remember writing that?" I did remember, though I hadn't expected anyone to take it seriously enough to flag it. It had been a passing thought, a single paragraph near the end of a document that ran 20 pages of statistical tables nobody but me had probably read in full. "I said it was a hypothesis," I said carefully, "not a conclusion. There wasn't enough data to draw a conclusion." "There's more data now," Marcus said, and something in his voice made the back of my neck prickle. "In the last 4 minutes, since the activation began, we've picked up something the sensors have never recorded before. A directional bias in the energy pattern. It's not radiating evenly from the structure. It's angling toward something." "Toward what?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he tapped a control on the nearby console, and a secondary display lit up beside the main viewport, showing a heat map of the energy readings, overlaid onto a schematic of our research station's layout. A bright corridor of color stretched from the portal's position on the surface, up through layers of rock and dust, through the station's outer hull, and pointed with unsettling precision at a section of the ship I recognized immediately. It was pointed at the research wing, at the exact corridor we were standing in. At me. "Elena," Marcus said, using my first name for the first time since I had come aboard. "I need you to tell me honestly. Have you approached the exclusion zone at any point since we arrived? Even accidentally? Even for a moment?" "No," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I've followed protocol exactly. I've never gone within 50 meters of the boundary." "Then can you explain why, 4 minutes ago, the moment this activation began, the energy signature started tracking a corridor that leads directly to your quarters?" I looked down at the heat map again, at the bright line of color bending unnaturally through solid rock and steel to find its way to a room I had been sleeping in only minutes before, and I understood, with a cold certainty that settled somewhere behind my ribs, that whatever had happened on that ancient silent world had not happened randomly. It had happened because of me. "I don't know why," I said, and for once in my life, that felt like the most dangerous sentence I had ever spoken, but I think we're about to find out. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, studying the golden pulse of light on the surface below, then looked back at me, with an expression I would remember for the rest of my life, somewhere between fear and something that might have been hope. "Get your suit," he said. "You're going down there." I did not sleep again that night. I do not think I slept again for many nights after that. Not truly. Not the way I had before I understood what waited beneath that dead planet's silent, watching sky, holding its breath for someone it had been waiting 3 generations, or perhaps far longer, to finally meet. The suit felt heavier than it should have, as the technicians sealed the final clasps around my shoulders, not because of its weight, which was standard for surface work on an airless world, but because of what waited for me at the bottom of the drop shaft. My hands were shaking slightly, and I pressed them flat against my thighs to stop it before anyone noticed. Nobody noticed. Everyone was too busy arguing. "This is reckless beyond anything I have witnessed in 4 centuries of Coalition service," Vex Oranis said, her voice sharp through the comm channel that connected the prep bay to the command deck above. "You intend to send an untrained civilian into an active exclusion zone based on a coincidence in energy readings." "It is not a coincidence," Thessaly Rowe replied, her tone carrying the particular calm that Draconi elders seem to cultivate over centuries of practice. "The counselor forgets that the structure has never once displayed a directional bias in 300 years of documented activity. A pattern this specific is not coincidence. It is intention." "Intention implies awareness," Vex snapped. "You are suggesting the artifact is not merely a mechanism but a mind." "I am suggesting we do not know what it is," Thessaly said, "and that uncertainty is precisely why caution should guide us, not fear." Marcus's voice cut through both of them, calm but final. "The decision has been made. Dr. Voss is suited and ready. We are not sending her alone. Captain Cross will accompany her to the edge of the exclusion boundary, and a full medical and security team will be on standby at the surface perimeter." I stood in the middle of the prep bay listening to 3 species argue about my life, as though I weren't standing close enough to hear every word, and I felt a strange, distant calm settle over me. Fear, I realized, could only stretch so far before it simply ran out of room, and mine had reached its limit somewhere between waking to the alarm and watching that corridor of light bend impossibly toward my own quarters. Captain Daniel Cross entered the prep bay a moment later, already suited, his helmet tucked under one arm. He was younger than most of the senior staff, with the kind of easy confidence that came from having flown more dangerous missions than anyone twice his age. He gave me a small nod, the kind meant to be reassuring, though I noticed his jaw was tight. "You ready for this?" he asked. "No," I said honestly, "but I don't think that matters anymore." He almost smiled at that. "Good answer. The ones who say yes are usually lying." We boarded the drop shuttle together, a small 4-person craft designed for short hops between the orbiting research vessel and the planet's dead surface. 2 security officers rode with us, their weapons holstered but present, a reminder that despite 3 generations of failure, nobody was willing to assume this world held no danger. Through the narrow viewport, I watched the planet grow larger, A gray and lifeless sphere with no oceans, no clouds, no green anywhere across its cracked and ancient crust. It looked like something that had died so long ago even its ghost had faded. "Tell me about the first expedition," I said to Cross, mostly to keep my mind from circling back to the fear I had pushed down. "The one that found the portal." "Before my time," he said, guiding the shuttle through a slow, careful descent. "But I read the logs when I transferred to this posting. A joint coalition survey found it almost 80 years ago, completely by accident. They were mapping mineral deposits and picked up an energy signature that didn't match anything natural. Took them 6 months just to excavate enough of the surrounding rock to see the whole structure." "And the first person who tried to approach it?" "Draconi biologist. Names in the historical records, though I don't remember it off the top of my head. Got within about 15 meters before the field caught her, knocked her back hard enough to break her arm in 2 places. After that, every species that came through tried their own approach, hoping maybe it was calibrated against something specific to Draconi biology. Vasp tried. Kathrani tried. A dozen others whose names you'd need a linguistics degree just to pronounce. And every single one failed." "Every single one," he confirmed. 11 meters became the unofficial boundary line. Nobody's ever gotten closer than that in 80 years. Not with vehicles, not with drones, not with anything alive or artificial. The field doesn't distinguish. It just says no. The shuttle touched down with a gentle shudder, and through the viewport I could see the research outpost that had been built around the site over the decades, a scattered collection of prefabricated domes and equipment shelters connected by covered walkways, all of it dwarfed by the structure rising from the ground half a kilometer beyond the perimeter fence. Even from this distance, even through reinforced glass, the portal was breathtaking in a way that pressed the air out of my lungs. It stood easily 40 meters tall, a ring of material so dark it seemed to swallow the weak starlight around it. Except now, threading across its surface, the golden lines of light pulsed steadily, patiently, like something ancient counting the seconds until I arrived. We disembarked into the thin gravity of the outpost's landing pad, and I felt Cross's hand briefly steady my elbow as my boots found their footing. The ground here was fine gray dust, undisturbed by wind or rain because there had been neither for longer than any species present could measure. Every footprint any visitor had ever left on this world was probably still there, preserved forever in the airless silence. We walked the half-kilometer to the perimeter fence in near silence, the 2 security officers flanking us a few paces back, their weapons still holstered, but their postures alert, in a way that told me they were more frightened than they wanted to admit. Ahead of us, the golden light of the portal grew larger, brighter, and I became aware of a low hum I could feel through the soles of my boots, rather than hear through my helmet, a vibration that seemed to originate from the structure itself, and pulse outward through the ground, like something breathing beneath the surface of the world. At the perimeter fence, a small crowd had gathered, scientists from 3 different species, all watching the structure through a mixture of instruments and their own eyes, none of them daring to step past the marked boundary line, 11 meters out. When they saw me approaching in my suit, a ripple of movement passed through them, murmurs I couldn't quite catch through the thin atmosphere and the muffling of my helmet. Cross stopped at the fence gate and turned to face me. "This is as far as protocol lets me go without direct authorization to breach the boundary myself," he said. "From here, it's your call. Nobody will think less of you if you want to turn back." I looked past him at the structure, at the golden light pulsing steadily across its dark surface, at the way it seemed to have grown brighter still in just the few minutes since we had landed, as though it could sense how close I now stood. "I need to know why it's doing this," I said. "I've spent 3 weeks staring at data that made no sense, and I think the answer is standing right in front of me. I can't walk away from that." Cross studied me for a moment, then nodded and stepped aside, opening the gate that led beyond the fence line. "Then let's find out together. I'm coming with you as far as the boundary allows." We walked forward, past the anxious eyes of the gathered scientists, past markers driven into the dust that recorded exactly how far each previous attempt had gotten before being repelled. 9 meters, 10 meters, 10.5. 11, the closest anyone had ever come. A small metal flag bent slightly where a Kathrani diplomat had been thrown backward decades earlier, breaking 3 ribs in the fall. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it over the low hum vibrating through the ground. 20 meters from the base of the portal now. 15. The golden light seemed to pulse faster the closer I came, and I found myself wondering, with a kind of vertigo that had nothing to do with the planet's low gravity, whether it was reacting to my approach or simply counting down to something that had already been decided, long before I ever set foot on this dead and patient world. At 12 meters, Cross stopped walking and held out an arm to stop me as well. "This is it," he said quietly. "One more step, and we're in territory nobody has ever survived crossing without injury. Are you sure about this?" I looked at the marker in the dust just ahead of us, the small bent flag that represented the absolute limit of 80 years of failure, and beyond it, the towering ring of dark material and golden light that had rejected every living thing that had ever reached for it. "I'm sure," I said, though my voice shook slightly on the words. "Whatever happens next, I need to know." I took a breath that tasted like recycled air and old fear, and I stepped past the boundary line that no one in recorded history had ever crossed and walked away from unhurt. Nothing happened for the first 3 steps, and in those 3 steps I felt something close to relief, a foolish, fleeting thought that maybe the field would catch me too, that I would be thrown back like everyone else, and this would all become a strange footnote in someone else's research paper, instead of the center of my own unraveling life. Then, on the 4th step, the ground beneath my boots began to hum louder, and the golden light spread across the portal's surface with a speed that stole the breath from my lungs. I did not feel a wall of force. I did not feel the crushing rejection that Cross had described from decades of failed attempts, the invisible barrier that had broken bones and thrown grown Draconi soldiers backward through the dust. Instead, I felt warmth spreading outward from the structure like sunlight breaking through clouds after a long winter, wrapping around me in a way that made no physical sense, and yet felt more real than the suit sealed tight around my body. Behind me, I heard Cross's voice through the comm, tight with something between awe and terror. "Voss, report your status. Now." "I'm fine," I said, my own voice barely steady. "I'm still standing. It's not pushing me back." "Confirm that," he said. "Say it again." "It's not rejecting me," I said, louder this time, for the benefit of whoever was listening on the other end of that channel, for the scientists at the fence line, for Marcus somewhere above us in orbit, for the historical record that would be studied for generations after this moment, regardless of what happened next. "The field isn't stopping me at all." I took another step forward, and the golden light responded, brightening further, the pulsing lines across the portal's surface beginning to shift and rearrange themselves into patterns I did not recognize, and yet somehow understood, on a level deeper than language, deeper than the years I had spent studying dead alphabets and forgotten grammars. It was not writing exactly. It was closer to breathing, to a heartbeat finding its rhythm after decades, perhaps centuries, of enforced stillness. 8 meters from the base now. The hum beneath my boots had grown strong enough that I could feel it in my teeth, a vibration that seemed to be tuning itself to something inside my own chest, matching the frantic rhythm of my pulse, and then, slowly, patiently, drawing it into a calmer cadence, the way a parent might soothe a frightened child without ever touching them. "Elena," Marcus's voice broke through the channel now, patched down from the orbiting vessel, his tone carrying an urgency I had never heard from him before. "The energy readings are spiking beyond anything our instruments can safely measure. If there's any sign of danger, any sign at all, I need you to fall back immediately." "There's no danger," I said, and I found, strangely, that I believed it completely. "It's not attacking me, it's welcoming me." 5 meters now. The golden light had spread across the entire visible surface of the ring, and the patterns shifting within it had begun to slow, settling into something that looked, impossibly, like symbols. Not the alien scripts I had spent years learning to translate for the Coalition archives. Not Kethrani glyphs, or VASP trademarks, or any of the dozen written languages catalogued across known space. Something older, something that seemed to exist just beneath the surface of every language I had ever studied, as though every alphabet humanity and its neighbors had ever developed was a distant echo of whatever this structure was trying to say. I stopped 3 meters from the base of the portal, close enough now that I could see fine details in its dark material, subtle textures that no scanner had ever detected, because no scanner had ever been allowed this close. Up close, it did not look like metal, or stone, or any substance I could easily categorize. It looked almost organic, like the surface of some vast, ancient creature that had chosen to sleep in this shape for reasons lost to time. The hum stopped. For one terrifying, suspended moment, everything went silent. The golden light froze mid-pulse, and I stood there in that airless silence with my heart pounding so loudly I was certain everyone on the comm channel could hear it. Certain that whatever decision this structure was making about me was happening in that single frozen breath, and that I had no way of knowing which way it would fall. Then the light surged. It did not push me backward. It did not throw me into the dust the way it had thrown every other visitor across 80 years of failed attempts. Instead, it rose upward from the ground, in a column of gold that surrounded me completely, warm and weightless, carrying a sensation I struggled afterward to describe to anyone who had not felt it themselves. It was recognition, not the mechanical recognition of a scanner reading an identification code, but something closer to the feeling of walking into a room full of strangers and finding, impossibly, a single familiar face turned toward you, waiting. Somewhere far behind me, I heard shouting through the comm channel, voices overlapping in alarm and disbelief, Cross calling my name, Marcus demanding status reports that nobody could give him fast enough, the security officers at the fence line scrambling into positions they had trained for, but never truly expected to use. None of it felt urgent to me in that moment. None of it felt like it belonged to the same reality I was standing in. The symbols across the portal's surface stopped shifting and settled into stillness, glowing steadily now instead of pulsing, and I understood, with a certainty that arrived from somewhere beneath conscious thought, that the structure had made its decision. It had chosen to open. A seam appeared where none had existed a moment before, splitting the dark ring down its center, and light spilled outward from within. Not the golden light of the surface patterns, but something whiter, purer, carrying with it a sound like a held breath finally released, after a wait too long to measure in ordinary time. The ground trembled beneath my boots, not violently, but with the deep, settling motion of something enormous shifting after a very long sleep. "Fall back," Marcus's voice cut through the chaos on the channel, sharp with command authority now. "Elena, fall back to the boundary immediately. That is a direct order." I wanted to obey. Some rational part of my mind, the part that had spent a career being careful and methodical and cautious, screamed at me to retreat, to put distance between myself and whatever was emerging from that opening seam of light. But my boots would not move. Not because some force held me in place, but because I could not make myself look away from what was happening in front of me, could not make myself abandon the moment that 3 generations of the best minds in the galaxy had spent their entire careers trying to reach. Through the widening seam in the portal's surface, I saw movement. Not a creature, not a machine in any form I recognized, but something that looked almost like a projection, a shape composed of the same golden light that had welcomed me, resolving slowly into a form that might once have been humanoid, might once have walked on 2 legs, and breathed air, and felt the same fear I was feeling now, except stretched and reshaped by however many thousands of years had passed since anything living had stood in this place. It did not speak in any language I knew. It did not need to. The moment the shape fully resolved and turned what might have been its face toward me, I felt a wave of information pour into my mind, not as words but as understanding, as though decades of study had been compressed into a single instant of contact. And somewhere in that flood of impossible knowledge, I understood one thing with absolute clarity before my vision blurred and my knees finally buckled beneath me. This portal had never been a barrier at all. It had been waiting. The last thing I registered before the world went dark was Cross's voice shouting my name as he crossed the boundary line himself, breaking 80 years of established protocol to catch me before I hit the ground, and the golden light of the portal continuing to burn steadily behind us, patient and unbothered, as though it had all the time in existence to wait for me to wake up and finally understand what it wanted to show me. I woke up in a sealed medical bay with a headache that felt like it had been carved into my skull with a dull blade, and the first thing I saw was Marcus, standing on the other side of a transparent quarantine wall, watching me, with an expression I couldn't quite read. "How long was I out?" I asked, my voice raspy, my throat dry as the dust of the planet we had left behind. 19 hours, he said. You gave us all a scare, Elena. Cross carried you back across the boundary himself. The field let him through carrying you, which is another thing nobody can explain. I pushed myself upright, wincing at the movement, and looked around the small isolation chamber. Monitors lined the walls, tracking my vitals with a level of attention usually reserved for patients in far worse condition than a headache and some bruised pride. Why am I in quarantine? Because half the Coalition Science Council wants to know if you brought something back with you, Marcus said, his tone carefully neutral in the way people speak when they're relaying someone else's suspicion rather than their own, and the other half wants to know if something changed inside you when that light surrounded you. Did it? I asked. Change me, I mean. He didn't answer right away, and that silence told me more than any words could have. Your neural scans show unusual activity, he finally said. Patterns the medical staff have never seen before. Not damage, not anything they can classify as harmful. Just different. They want more time to study it before they clear you to leave isolation. I closed my eyes and tried to remember what had happened in that final moment before I lost consciousness. The flood of information that had poured into my mind, like a river breaking through a dam that had held for far too long. Fragments remained, scattered and incomplete, like trying to recall a dream hours after waking, a sense of vast time, a sense of waiting, patient and deliberate, stretching across ages I couldn't begin to measure, and underneath all of it, a single impression that had settled into my chest like a stone and refused to leave. It chose me, I said quietly, not randomly, not by accident. There was a reason. Marcus leaned closer to the transparent wall between us. The council is going to ask you exactly what that reason is, and I need you to understand something before they do. There are factions on this station, and beyond it, who are already treating what happened as a threat rather than a discovery. The VASP delegation filed a formal protest 4 hours ago, demanding the site be sealed and all research suspended until a full multi-species review can determine what occurred. A protest against what? I didn't do anything except walk toward a structure that decided not to hurt me. That's exactly what frightens them, Marcus said. 80 years of failure, across a dozen species, and then a human walks up, and the entire artifact responds. Do you understand how that looks to a council that has spent generations trying not to let humanity's rapid rise become a source of galactic instability? I hadn't considered that angle, caught up as I had been in the personal disorientation of waking up in a sealed room with a headache and half-remembered visions. But now that Marcus said it aloud, the shape of the problem became clear with an unpleasant clarity. Humanity had joined the coalition only 2 generations ago, later than almost every other member species, and in that short time had already outpaced older civilizations in several fields that mattered to the balance of power among the stars. An ancient structure, one that had rejected every other species for the better part of a century, suddenly opening for a human, would not be received as good news by everyone listening. What happens now? I asked. Now you rest, and you prepare, Marcus said. The council convenes in 6 hours. They're going to want a full account of what you experienced, and they're going to want to know if you can access the portal again, deliberately this time, rather than by whatever instinct drove you to approach it in the first place. 6 hours later, still faintly unsteady on my feet, I stood before a holographic council chamber that connected delegates from a dozen worlds, their images arranged in a wide circle around a central podium where I stood alone, feeling smaller than I had felt at any point since arriving in this section of the galaxy. Vex Uranus's projection stood closest to the front, her posture rigid with the particular stillness her species adopted when preparing to argue a point they considered urgent. Dr. Voss, she began without preamble, you will describe, in full detail, everything you experienced from the moment you crossed the boundary line to the moment you lost consciousness. I did, as best I could. I described the warmth instead of the expected rejection, the golden light rising around me like sunrise, the symbols that shifted and settled and seemed to speak without sound, the shape that resolved from the widening seam in the portal's surface, and the flood of understanding that had overwhelmed me before everything went dark. I left nothing out, though the telling made the memory feel strangely distant, like describing a story I had heard rather than lived. When I finished, silence stretched across the chamber for a long moment, before Vex spoke again. You claim the structure communicated with you directly, and yet you cannot articulate what was communicated beyond vague impressions of time and waiting. Forgive me, Doctor, but that account offers this council very little to act on. I'm not hiding anything, I said, keeping my voice steady despite the frustration building beneath my ribs. What happened to me wasn't a conversation with clear sentences and clear answers. It was closer to absorbing decades of context in a single instant. I'm still sorting through what I retained. Then perhaps, Vex said, this council should consider whether allowing further contact is wise, given how little control the subject appears to have over the process. Thessaly Rowe's projection turned slightly, her ancient eyes settling on Vex with a patience that carried its own quiet authority. Counselor, I understand the impulse toward caution. I share it. But consider what we witnessed. 80 years of failure ended in a matter of minutes. Whatever criteria this structure has been applying to every visitor who has ever approached it, Dr. Voss satisfied that criteria, without training, without preparation, and without any conscious effort to do so. That is not a small thing to dismiss out of fear. It is precisely the kind of thing that should be approached with fear, Vex replied. Power that arrives without explanation is the most dangerous kind. I stood at the podium, watching two ancient species argue about my fate, and the fate of a discovery I still barely understood myself, and I felt something shift inside me, a resolve hardening in place of the fear that had carried me through the last day and a half. With respect to this council, I said, loud enough to draw every projected gaze back toward me, I didn't ask for this. I didn't seek out some advantage or plan to be chosen for anything. I walked toward a structure because the data suggested it might respond differently to me, and it did, for reasons none of us understand yet. But I think refusing to study what happened, out of fear of what it might mean, is exactly the kind of mistake that has kept this mystery unsolved for 3 generations. Marcus, standing near the edge of the chamber, caught my eye and gave the faintest nod of approval. What I'm asking this council to consider, I continued, is that fear has already tried this approach. Fear has watched this structure from a safe distance for 80 years and learned nothing. I'm not suggesting we proceed recklessly. I'm suggesting that the only way to understand what's happening, and to determine whether it poses any danger at all, is to continue studying it directly, carefully, and transparently, with every species represented on this council watching every step. The chamber fell silent again, delegates exchanging glances across species that rarely agreed on anything, weighing a decision that would shape not just my future, but potentially the future of contact between every civilization gathered in that circle. Finally, an elder Kathrani delegate I had not yet heard speak raised a slender hand for attention. I move that we authorize continued study under strict multi-species oversight, she said, her translated voice carrying a quiet gravity that seemed to settle the room. Dr. Voss will be permitted further contact with the structure, accompanied at all times by observers from at least 3 member species, with full documentation shared across the coalition in real time. The vote that followed was not unanimous. Vex Uranus's faction abstained, rather than support the motion outright, a silence that felt more like a warning than an agreement. But the motion passed, and as the holographic chamber began to dissolve around me, delegates fading back to their distant worlds, I understood that whatever came next, I would not be facing it alone, and I would not be facing it without powerful voices already working against the very discovery I had been chosen, for reasons I still could not explain, to make. Marcus walked with me back toward the medical wing afterward, both of us quiet for a long stretch of corridor before he finally spoke. You did well in there, he said. Better than I expected, honestly. I don't feel like I did well, I admitted. I feel like I just volunteered to walk back into something I barely survived once. Maybe, Marcus said. But you also just bought yourself the chance to actually understand what happened, instead of spending the rest of your career locked in a quarantine chamber, while people argue about what to do with you. That's not nothing. I thought about the shape that had resolved from the golden light, the flood of understanding that had overwhelmed me before I lost consciousness, and the single certainty that had remained afterward, settled deep in my chest, like something I had always known, but never had the words to express. The portal had been waiting, not for a species, not for a government or a fleet, or a delegation of careful, credentialed scientists. It had been waiting for someone specific, and somehow, against every probability that 80 years of failure suggested, that someone had turned out to be me. 3 days passed before the council finalized the protocols for my second approach. 3 days I spent buried in old archive footage, trying to prepare myself for something I suspected no amount of preparation could truly ready me for. I studied every failed contact attempt on record, watched grainy recordings of Draconi and Vasp and Kethrani visitors being thrown backward by a force that had never once hesitated for them the way it apparently had for me, and I searched for any thread of commonality that might explain why. I found nothing conclusive, but I found something in myself I hadn't expected, a kind of quiet, stubborn resolve that had nothing to do with scientific curiosity anymore, and everything to do with a feeling I couldn't quite name, a sense that the structure and I had unfinished business that neither of us could walk away from now. When the day finally came, I made the walk toward the boundary line with 3 observers this time, a Kethrani biologist named Lyra Van, a young Draconi researcher whose name I never quite caught over the comm static, and Captain Cross once again at my side, this time with formal authorization to accompany me as far as the field allowed. The perimeter had grown crowded since my first approach, delegations from across the coalition arriving in the days since to witness whatever happened next, and I felt the weight of all those watching eyes as I crossed the same boundary line I had crossed once before. This time, the response came instantly. The golden light rose around me the moment I passed the 11-meter mark, warm and familiar now instead of terrifying, and I heard soft gasps of astonishment through the comm channel from the observers watching at the fence line, none of whom had witnessed the first activation in person. I walked forward without hesitation this time, straight to the base of the structure, close enough to press my gloved hand against its dark, textured surface. The moment I touched it, the seam split open just as it had before, and the golden light poured outward, resolving once again into that humanoid shape composed of pure, patient radiance. This time, I did not lose consciousness. This time, the flood of understanding came slower, more deliberately, as though whatever intelligence guided this ancient structure had learned something from our first encounter and chosen to pace itself, to let me absorb what it offered, without overwhelming my mind entirely. I saw them then, not clearly, not as individuals with faces and names, but as impressions layered across vast stretches of time, a civilization that had risen and thrived and eventually faded, long before any species currently gathered around this dead world had learned to walk upright. They called themselves something my mind translated only as the Wardens, though I understood even as the word formed that it was an imperfect approximation, a human concept forced onto a truth far stranger and older than any single word could capture. The Wardens had traveled between the stars long before any current civilization had begun counting its history, and in that traveling, they had learned something that troubled them deeply. Every civilization they encountered, given enough time and enough power, eventually faced the same choice, and most of them chose safety over growth, comfort over risk, the slow, careful stagnation of species that had learned to fear their own potential more than they feared their own extinction. The Wardens had built structures like this one across a scattering of worlds, seeding them with technology and knowledge far beyond what any young civilization could achieve on its own, but they had not built them to be found easily, and they had not built them to open for just anyone. They had built them as tests, patient and unhurried, waiting not for the first species clever enough to locate them, but for the first species brave enough, reckless enough, defiantly hopeful enough, to keep reaching for something everyone else had already decided was impossible. I understood, in that flood of impression and memory, why every other species had failed. It was not a flaw in the Kethrani, or the Vasp, or the Draconi. It was simply that each of those civilizations, in their own ways, over their own long histories, had learned caution as their highest virtue, had built entire cultures around the careful avoidance of unnecessary risk, and the structure had been built to recognize that caution, gently and without malice, and to turn it away, waiting instead for something else. Humanity, in all its short, chaotic history, had never fully learned that lesson. We had built civilizations that repeatedly walked to the edge of disaster in pursuit of the next horizon, that kept reaching, even when every rational voice counseled retreat, that treated the impossible less as a wall and more as an invitation. It was not always our wisest trait. I understood that too, in the flood of memory the wardens offered me. Understood the wreckage that trait had left scattered across our own history, the wars, and the mistakes, and the reckless costs of a species too stubborn to know when to stop. But it was also, apparently, exactly what this ancient structure had been waiting to find. The shape of golden light before me shifted, and I felt something that might have been the closest thing to an emotion the wardens had left behind in this place, something that resembled hope, patient and fragile, after so many failed centuries of watching and waiting. They had built more than this single portal. They had scattered structures like it across dozens of worlds throughout this region of the galaxy, each one waiting for the same test to be met, each one holding fragments of knowledge and infrastructure that no current civilization possessed. Gifts meant not for whoever arrived first, but for whoever proved capable of receiving them without breaking under the weight of what they represented. I felt the vision begin to fade, my own mind reasserting itself against the flood of borrowed memory, and in the last moments before the connection released me, I understood one final thing, with a clarity that settled into my bones like something permanent. This was never meant to remain secret. The wardens had wanted their test to be witnessed, had wanted whichever species finally succeeded to carry that success back to their own people, transparently, so that the choice of what to do with this discovery would belong not to me alone, and not to the structure itself, but to everyone watching, everyone capable of understanding what it meant that the long silence had finally broken. I opened my eyes to find myself still standing, still upright, Cross's hand steady on my shoulder where he had moved to catch me if I fell, though this time I hadn't needed catching. The golden light around me was already beginning to settle, the humanoid shape dissolving back into the structure's dark surface, its work for this encounter apparently finished. "Elena," Cross said carefully, "are you with us?" "I'm here," I said, my voice unsteady, but my mind clearer than it had been in days. "I need to speak to the Council immediately, all of them, every species represented, not just the Coalition leadership." "What did you see?" he asked. I looked past him, toward the crowd of observers gathered at the fence line, toward the delegations from a dozen worlds who had traveled across the stars to witness whatever happened next, and I felt the enormous weight of what I was about to tell them settle onto my shoulders. "I saw why we were chosen," I said, "and I need everyone to understand what that means, because this isn't just my discovery anymore. This belongs to every species willing to listen, and some of them are not going to like what they hear." The council chamber convened again within hours of my second contact, but this time the holographic circle had grown larger, delegations joining from worlds that had never before shown interest in the slow, quiet research conducted around a dead planet's ancient mystery. Word had spread faster than anyone anticipated, and not always through official channels. I stood at the podium again, steadier this time, and delivered everything I had learned. The wardens. The pattern of tests scattered across dozens of worlds. The trait the structure had been waiting to find, the reckless, defiant refusal to accept limits that every other coalition species had, over centuries of careful civilization, learned to set aside in favor of stability. I watched the reaction ripple across the chamber as I spoke, and I understood almost immediately that this revelation would not be received the way I had hoped. Vex Uranus was the first to speak once I finished, and her voice carried none of the measured skepticism she had shown days earlier. This time it carried something closer to alarm. "You are telling this council," she said, "that an ancient and unknown power specifically selected humanity, out of every species that has ever approached this structure, because your civilization possesses insufficient caution. Do you understand how that sounds to the rest of us?" "I understand it sounds concerning," I said carefully, "but I'm not asking anyone to celebrate this. I'm reporting what I experienced, as accurately as I can, because I believe every species represented here deserves to know the truth, rather than a version shaped to be comfortable." "The truth," Vex said, "is that an unknown power, with unknown motives, has chosen to grant unprecedented access and resources to the youngest, least predictable civilization in this coalition. Forgive me if that truth alarms me more than it comforts me." Murmurs spread through the chamber, delegates from a dozen worlds exchanging glances that carried centuries of accumulated caution behind them. I felt the room shifting beneath me, felt the goodwill I had earned in the previous council session eroding under the weight of a revelation that, however honestly delivered, played directly into every fear a cautious civilization might hold about a younger, hungrier neighbor suddenly handed a key that nobody else could turn. Thessaly Rose spoke next, and though her tone remained measured, I heard something new beneath it, a careful distance that hadn't been there before. Dr. Voss, I do not doubt your honesty. But I must ask, on behalf of my people and many others gathered here, what safeguards exist to ensure that whatever knowledge or technology this structure ultimately offers does not become a weapon turned against the rest of us? I don't know, I admitted, because pretending otherwise would have been a lie I couldn't afford to tell in front of this many watching eyes. I don't control what the structure offers, and I don't speak for my entire species any more than any of you speak for the full will of yours. All I can tell you is what I've learned, and let this council decide together what happens next. It was not enough. I understood that even as the words left my mouth, watching the chamber's mood harden into something closer to fear than curiosity. Over the following days, that fear did not fade. It grew. Reports reached the research station faster than official channels could manage them, rumors spreading across a dozen inhabited systems about the human who had somehow unlocked an ancient mystery that had defeated every other species for generations. Some of those rumors were close to the truth. Many were not. I heard whispered versions of the story that painted the portal as a weapon, myself as some kind of unwitting trigger for a doomsday device. Humanity as a species secretly engineered by unknown forces to eventually conquer the stars. None of it was true, but truth, I was learning quickly, mattered less in moments like this than fear did, and fear traveled faster than any correction could hope to catch. Marcus found me on the observation deck 4 days after the second contact, staring down at the fleet of ships that had begun gathering in orbit around the dead planet, more arriving with every passing hour, their configurations belonging to at least 6 different coalition member species. That's not a science delegation anymore, I said quietly as he approached. No, Marcus agreed, his expression grim. That's a show of force. Several factions have requested authority to seize control of the excavation site, citing security concerns. A few have gone further, suggesting the structure itself should be destroyed before it can grant humanity any further advantage. They can't be serious, I said, though even as I spoke, I understood exactly how serious fear could make an entire civilization when it believed its own survival was at stake. Some of them are very serious, Marcus said. The VASP delegation has requested an emergency vote to authorize a containment strike if the structure activates again, without full coalition oversight present. Several other delegations are considering supporting the motion, not because they believe it's the right choice, but because they're afraid of what happens if they don't, and humanity ends up holding something the rest of the galaxy can't match. I felt something cold settle in my chest, a fear, different from anything I had experienced standing in front of the portal itself. That fear had been personal, immediate, tied to my own survival in a single dangerous moment. This fear was larger, slower, and far more dangerous precisely because it belonged not to me, but to entire civilizations acting out of a logic that made a terrible kind of sense from their perspective. What do we do? I asked. We don't have many good options, Marcus admitted. If the vote passes, this station could be ordered to stand down and allow a multi-species strike force to neutralize the site. If we refuse, we risk turning a scientific discovery into the opening move of a conflict none of us can afford. And if the vote fails, then we buy time, he said. But I don't think that solves anything long-term. Sooner or later, this council is going to have to decide what to do about the fact that an ancient power just handed humanity something no other species in this coalition can access. And I don't think fear is going away, just because we ask it nicely. I looked back down at the gathering fleet, ships from a dozen worlds arranging themselves in careful formation around a planet that had held its secret in patient silence for longer than any of those civilizations had existed, and I thought about the shape of golden light that had shown me why humanity had been chosen, the reckless, defiant refusal to accept the limits everyone else had learned to respect. Perhaps, I thought, that same trait was about to be tested again, not by an ancient structure this time, but by a galaxy full of frightened neighbors, deciding whether the discovery I had made was a gift worth protecting or a threat worth destroying before it could grow any larger. "There's something else," Marcus said, his voice dropping lower, and I recognized in his tone the particular caution of someone about to share information he wasn't entirely supposed to share. "Command intercepted a transmission 12 hours ago. A faction within the vast military, not officially sanctioned by their government, but with enough resources to act independently, is planning to move against the site directly, ahead of any council vote. They don't intend to wait for permission." "When?" "Our intelligence suggests within the next 2 days," Marcus said, "which means whatever we're going to do to protect this discovery, and to prove it, isn't the threat everyone fears it to be, we need to do it fast." I turned away from the viewport and looked at Marcus directly, feeling the same stubborn resolve that had carried me across that boundary line settle once more into place, harder now, sharper, shaped by everything I had learned about why the structure had chosen me in the first place. "Then, I need to go back down there," I said. "One more time. If the Wardens built this to be a test that proves something about what a civilization is capable of, then maybe the only way to convince the rest of this coalition that humanity isn't a threat is to show them exactly what this discovery is actually meant to offer, before fear makes that choice for all of us." Marcus studied me for a long moment, weighing the risk of what I was proposing against the fleet gathering in orbit, and the deadline ticking down toward a confrontation none of us were prepared to survive. "Then we'd better move fast," he said finally, "because right now, Elena, you might be the only thing standing between a discovery that could change everything, and a war that ends it, before anyone gets the chance to understand what it truly means." We had less time than any of us wanted, and every hour that passed felt like sand, slipping through fingers, too tired to hold it any longer. Marcus authorized the third approach within 6 hours of our conversation on the observation deck, overriding the Council's usual layers of procedure with an urgency that told me he understood exactly how narrow our window had become. The fleet in orbit had grown larger still, ships from the vast military now clearly separated from the rest of the coalition formation, positioned with a precision that felt less like observation and more like preparation. I tried not to look at them too long as the shuttle carried me down toward the surface one final time, tried to keep my focus on what waited below rather than what might be descending from above within the next 2 days. Cross flew the shuttle again, quieter than usual, and Lyra Van, the Kethrani biologist who had observed my second contact, rode alongside us, this time as an official witness, her presence meant to ensure that whatever happened next would be documented by more than just human eyes. "If this goes wrong," Cross said as we descended through the thin atmosphere toward the research outpost, "there won't be a fourth chance to fix it." "I know," I said. "That's exactly why it has to work." We reached the perimeter fence to find a larger crowd than ever before, delegations from every corner of the coalition standing shoulder to shoulder along the boundary line, their expressions ranging from curiosity to open suspicion. I walked past all of them without slowing, past the small bent flag that still marked 80 years of failure, past the boundary that no longer held any power over me, and straight toward the ring of dark material standing patient and silent under the pale, starless sky. This time, I did not wait for the golden light to rise around me gradually. I pressed both hands flat against the structure's surface the moment I reached it, and the response came instantly, overwhelming, as though the Wardens themselves had been waiting for exactly this moment of urgency, this final test within the test. "Show them," I said aloud, my voice carrying across the thin atmosphere to every observer watching through their suits and instruments. "Whatever you were built to offer, whatever you were waiting to give, I need you to show all of them, not just me. This can't be a secret. It can't be something that makes anyone else afraid. It has to be something everyone can see, or it isn't worth having at all." The seam split wide open, wider than either previous encounter, and the golden light that poured outward this time did not stay contained to the small space immediately around me. It spread outward across the entire excavation site, washing over the gathered delegations at the fence line, over the security officers and the scientists, and the anxious representatives of a dozen worlds who had come expecting either a miracle or a threat, and were about to receive something far stranger than either. The shape of light resolved before me once more, and this time, as the flood of understanding poured into my mind, I felt it branch outward as well, reaching toward every consciousness gathered within the light's expanding reach. sharing not just with me but with everyone present the truth the wardens had built this structure to eventually reveal. I understood, in that shared vision, that the gift being offered was never meant for humanity alone. It was meant for whoever proved capable of receiving it without breaking, without hoarding it, without turning it into a weapon against their neighbors out of fear or ambition. The reckless, defiant trait that had opened this particular structure to me was only the first test, a door rather than a destination, and the true gift waiting beyond it. Scattered knowledge and technology across dozens of worlds throughout this region of the galaxy would only ever be fully unlocked by cooperation between every civilization willing to approach it with open hands rather than closed fists. I felt the collective shock ripple through every mind touched by that shared vision, felt Vex Uranus's fear soften, not disappear entirely, but soften into something closer to cautious understanding, as she witnessed for herself exactly what the wardens had intended. I felt Thessaly Rowe's ancient patience settle into something like quiet vindication. Decades of careful caution, finally rewarded, with an answer worth the long wait. I felt observers from species I had never even met experience, for the first time, direct contact with the mystery that had shaped coalition history for 3 generations, and I understood that whatever fear had gathered in orbit above us, whatever fleet stood ready to strike against a threat that had never truly existed, would have to reckon now with a truth too large and too openly shared to be destroyed or contained. The vision began to fade, gently this time, not the sudden collapse of my first encounter, but a slow release, as though the structure understood its work here was finally, truly finished. I opened my eyes to find the entire excavation site bathed in soft golden light, delegates from a dozen worlds standing in stunned silence along the fence line, many of them still processing the shared vision that had just rewritten everything they thought they understood about this ancient mystery. Marcus's voice broke through the comm channel, quieter than I expected, carrying something that sounded almost like relief. Elena, the VASP military faction just stood down. Command intercepted their communications. They're recalling their ships. Why? I asked, though I thought I already knew the answer. Because half their crew just experienced that vision too, he said. You can't order soldiers to attack something they just watched offer itself freely to every species willing to receive it. Whatever fear drove that faction to move against this site, it's a lot harder to sustain, now that the truth is standing in plain sight, instead of hidden behind rumors and suspicion. I looked around at the gathered delegations, at Vex Uranus standing motionless near the fence line, her earlier hostility replaced by something more complicated, something that looked almost like the beginning of trust rather than its opposite. Thessaly Rowe met my eyes across the distance and offered a slow, deliberate nod, the closest thing to approval I had seen from her since this entire journey began. The portal behind me settled into a steady, gentle glow, no longer pulsing with the urgent rhythm of a structure making a decision, but shining instead with the calm patience of something that had finally completed the purpose it was built for so many thousands of years ago. I understood, standing there in the fading light with my whole body exhausted and my mind still humming with borrowed memory, that this was not truly an ending at all. It was a beginning, for humanity and for every species gathered around this dead, ancient world, a threshold crossed together instead of alone, an inheritance, offered not to the strongest or the oldest or the most cautious, but to whoever proved willing to reach for something impossible and share whatever they found with open hands. Marcus met me at the shuttle when I finally made my way back across the boundary line that no longer held any meaning for anyone who chose to cross it honestly. He didn't say anything at first, just studied my face with an expression that mixed exhaustion and something close to wonder. "You did it," he finally said. "You actually did it." "We did it," I corrected him. This was never going to work if it stayed something only humanity could see. The wardens built it to test more than courage. They built it to test whether we were capable of sharing what we found once we found it. Above us, the fleet that had gathered in fear and suspicion began, slowly, cautiously, to disperse, ships breaking formation and returning to their respective territories, no longer united by the shared anxiety of an unknown threat, but scattered instead by the shared understanding of an unexpected gift. It would take time, I knew, for that fear to fully fade, for trust to fully take root where suspicion had grown so easily. Old habits and older fears did not disappear in a single afternoon, no matter how bright the light that had briefly united every watching species in a single shared vision. But as I looked up at the golden glow still radiating softly from the ancient structure behind me, casting long shadows across a world that had waited in silence for longer than any current civilization could measure, I understood that something fundamental had shifted, not just for humanity, but for every species willing to reach toward whatever came next together. The portal had rejected everyone for 80 years, waiting patiently for someone willing to test the limits of the impossible, and then, having found what they sought, choose to share it rather than keep it. It had found that someone in the most unlikely place, in a linguist who had spent her career studying dead languages rather than living ones, and in doing so, it had opened not just a doorway to ancient knowledge, but a doorway to a future no one currently gathered around this dead world could have fully imagined. I was still standing there, watching the last of the fleet withdraw into the dark quiet of orbit, when Cross came to stand beside me, his own expression thoughtful in the fading golden light. "So, what happens now?" he asked. I looked out across the gray, ancient landscape, toward the structure that had waited so long for exactly this moment, and I felt, for the first time since the alarm had woken me from sleep so many days ago, something that felt almost like peace settling into place beside the exhaustion. "Now," I said, "we find out what else is waiting for us out there, and we make sure that whatever we find, we're brave enough to share it." Behind us, the portal continued to glow, patient and steady, no longer a mystery guarding its silence, but a door standing open at last, waiting for whoever came next to walk through it together.